Yes, and I have the pleasure to introduce now our second speaker, which is not really necessary for the people here in Tartu to present her. Raili Marling is, of course, a very important figure here, not only as a very influential administrator, but also as a prolific scholar. Raili is a professor of English studies with a clear focus on American culture and literature, mostly contemporary literature, and topics that are at the center of her interests are effect and neoliberalism. And she is, as she mentioned already before, very quickly now leading one of the big Estonian grant projects, and that is on representations and representability of crisis, and so very much also related to what we are doing here. Yeah, so all these topics, effect, neoliberalism as well, and representability and crisis as such come together in this notion of biopolitics and of course in everything that's happening at the moment. So she's very qualified and to talk to us now about this with the title Relationality and Representability of Biopolitical Crisis. Thank you.
So I will begin by saying that I have had the luxury of knowing what other people talk about. And so I will not talk about Agamben, I will not talk about Foucault, and I will basically be doing kind of a Monty Python version of something completely different so that we expand the vocabulary a little bit. So I will actually be talking quite a lot about neoliberalism and making some claims around that in the context of the present biopolitical crisis. My sort of opening gambit here is to say that the COVID pandemic and the related public health measures across the world seem like a textbook example of a biopolitical event. And we have had a lot of discussion of the event and the crisis as this hyper-object, hyper-event, so on and so forth, especially because of the surveillance regimes and restrictions that were imposed all over the world for the sake of public health. However, and this has been puzzling me in the light of what Daniele also said, in the context in which we actually are supposed to have this mega event, we also have a very actually wide scale of resistance, not necessarily just protests, but people just failing to do what they're supposed to do all the time. I mean, who of us has not disobeyed these rules? I think that despite all of our ritualistic behaviors, we are scofflaws of biopolitics, and I think we're still here. It seems like we're still here. And so it seems to me that in the context of what seems to be a hyperbolic event, we actually have an example of biopolitical failure, as argued by Armin Jean and Marion Veyron. The dream of biopolitical control has proved to be impossible, even during surveillance capitalism, even in countries that have for the past 30 years valorized e-governance and surveillance like Estonia. In other words, in some senses, I'm going to argue that we have a failure of an event, because the world already was too used to living in crisis ordinariness, as Laurent Berland calls it. We already were too used to bare life. So COVID-19 just added to it, and its actual implications haven't sunk in. However, I believe COVID-19 is an important crisis, and it has allowed us to discuss certain issues because of the disruption it has created. And if there's one thing that neoliberalism has taught us, one should not let a good crisis go to waste. And this is what I will be talking about. So I will talk not so much about biopolitical control as to what else. After all, the biopolitical failures we have seen during COVID-19 crisis and its unimpressive handling both by welfare states and welfare-less states like the United States suggest that the biopolitical power is not all-powerful. This paper hypothesizes, and I'm not ready by no means with any conclusions, is first of all our lack of attention to imaginaries or limits of imaginability. This is, as Mark already said, an issue that I have been thinking about for several years now, and in particular in the context of what Rob Nixon has called slow violence. Nixon uses this term to describe and this is a quote from him, the violence wrought by climate change, toxic drift, deforestation, oil spills, and the environmental aftermath of war that takes place gradually and often invisibly. I have been extending this notion from environmentalism to different processes of attrition that characterize precarious contemporary society in which old promises of good life, or even bare life, are no longer sustainable. Slow violence and its invisible, eventless progress is a representational challenge. As already Aldo Leopold said, we can be ethical only towards what we can see. We respond to what we feel strongly about. But what happens if the very nature of the process refuses representation? It cannot be uttered. It refuses to congeal into an event, is basically what I'm talking about. And I think we all can see this in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. We all know, like climate change, that it exists. It's somewhere. But at the same time, we don't see it. We don't feel it. Frequently, it depends on what cultic practices we engage in. And think of the literary representations of pandemics. They tend to focus on spectacular killer viruses, the plague, AIDS, Ebola, because they provide us with something that can be represented, which is the destruction of the body. And think about what everybody was reading Defoe, everybody was reading Decameron and Camus, then everybody was also watching Wolfgang Petersen's Outbreak from 1995 about Ebola, Steven Soderbergh's Contagion, hemorrhagic fever, or even Lawrence Wright's eerily prescient bestseller at the end of October, which I stopped reading because it became too scary, because it gets the global pandemic fright right. But it also talks about hemorrhagic fever, people bleeding to death. In other words, effective narrative seems to depend on dramatic representations, especially in our time of sensational, spectacle-driven messaging. Slow violence of things like flu, or for that matter, COVID-19, is complicated. And what makes it even more complicated is the context. As Lorraine Berlant, I will quote her a lot. Everybody who knows me knows that I always quote her. It's a great tragedy of my life that she's no longer with us. So Berlant argues that, quote, it is very hard to produce a satisfying aesthetic event about the drama of not mattering, where not mattering is a general historical condition. We can translate this idea that Berlant uses about precarity related to contemporary capitalism to representations of biopolitical crises like COVID-19. Yes, we already have literary representations, but they tend to focus more on the questions of disciplinary practices and control, and less on the lowercase drama of survival, mattering, being material in this physical world. And yet it is this that seems to characterize COVID-19 for most people. We seem to be actively passive. And this interests me in the context of our general ability to respond to crisis. I think that COVID-19 is opaque in the way that I'm going to call generative today. And this is what I will spend a lot of time with today. I will talk about a contemporary work of fiction that works by evasion, I would argue, and as such, I believe, captures some of the very central tensions surrounding biopolitics, especially its failure. And just to expand the range of references, I will be using the work of Rosie Braidotti and Judith Butler for a change, just to have other names on the table. So the example I'm going to use is probably something nobody has read or even heard about. It's a novel by an American author, Ling Ma, called Severance from 2018. So a book written before the pandemic. And it talks about a China virus. So I got that one right. It remains invisible in the novel, and I will focus on the affects it creates. The pandemic in that novel arrives in a world where crisis is ordinary, and no easy recipes of salvation are offered at the end of the novel. My paper will argue that such impassive representations are central to the understanding of why biopolitics fails, especially today. Many narratives of biopolitics nowadays are couched in nostalgia, the kind of former rituals, the kinds of stuff that Tim was also talking about. And this kind of a hypothetical pastoral vision of some past in which there was no biopolitical control is, well, impossible. As we heard from multiple speakers today, there always has been biopolitical control. Instead, we need to expand our biopolitical imaginations and think about biopower and whether we can do something with it. The frame of some of the things I'm going to say might be surprising to some, because most of my research really has been about power, and specifically the power that operates within the precarity regimes of contemporary neoliberalism, in which there is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher famously said. As Foucault, okay, I'm saying his name, already showed, the neoliberal society has taken a pastoral power by promising salvation through an entrepreneurial way of life. This is not merely an issue of economics or ideology, but also biopolitics, as citizens have been turned into entrepreneurs of themselves who survive individually and ignore the community they belong into. In other words, a sort of a bare life, but not Agambennian, has become an accepted social norm already before COVID-19 pandemic. This is the condition that Laurent Berlant has talked about quite a lot. The historical sensorium, as she calls, that has developed in the context in which our fantasies are increasingly removed from reality, and in which we can no longer depend on job security, upward mobility, meaningful equality, or enduring intimacy, or even that life as a project would add up to something. I love that quote deeply. What has been lost, according to Berlant, is good life fantasies that equate frictionless with justice and satisfaction with the absence of frustration. This, in turn, creates structures of conflicting feelings that I have talked about elsewhere. I can just briefly summarize. We invest in illusions of happiness, although the contrary affective pulls generate depression, unease, and impasse. Berlant discusses impasse specifically as, quote, animated suspension, unquote, in which people just try to endure until they figure out how to adjust. Again, to me, a very useful quote. In this impasse, Berlant puts it in a very memorable phrase: everyone's now a hustler. This is our existence. We all hustle to survive. Although Berlant said these words in an interview in 2011, they became newly relevant during COVID-19 pandemic, which brought this language into public discourse. Indeed, we all hustled to get by. Yes, there was too much banana bread, there was too much yoga advice, but not only. The acceptance of the hustle of life became utterable in the context of the crisis, and I think that's a useful thing to keep in mind. In this context, of course, we should remember not just Foucault's writing on biopolitics, but also his late life ethical turn, in which he seeks to answer the question of how to speak truth to power, or also how to live well. In the context of biopolitics, this form of truth-telling, however, needs to start from the identification of a way of living that is not bare. And this is where I want to go to the topic of relationality and shared vulnerability. As I said already, very unusually for me, I'm trying to move away from the interpretation of biopolitics conceived narrowly as something that happens under the sanctions of the state. Deleuze, among other people, reminds us that there is also biopower, and asks, quote, when power becomes biopower, resistance becomes the power of life. Is not life this capacity to resist force? I think that we need to believe in this in some ways if we are to remain human. This is also the question that animates the following discussion, and I think helps to explain some of the biopolitical failures under COVID-19. And this is why I actually went back to Rosie Braidotti, whose one essay I deeply hated roughly 5 years ago. And I reread it over the summer, and you know, that's what COVID does to you. It makes you read things differently. Because she reminds us that we are used to mostly talking about potestas, in other words, power. And in her different writings, she has also invited us to think about potentia, in other words, experimentations with new arts of existence and new ethical relations. In other words, she invites us to think beyond the observation of bare life as a new norm. Yes, but, I mean, where do we go from here? We need to have something else. And expand the view of different aspects of life as a potential site of political engagement. in the spirit of Deleuzean politics of becoming, for example. If we just resort to critique, we will not get out of the vicious circle. I mean, we will just be looping in the same side. I was just thinking about this in connection with Slavoj Žižek and his famous T-shirt, "I'd prefer not to," with which he argued. Well, I'll come back to that. And the reason why many people might find this surprising in my speech is that I have been very critical of Braidotti's search for positive program in the context of capitalist realism. It seems like really bad time to let go of critique, like worst time ever. But I'm coming back to it during the pandemic because when this sense of dominance and control became such a hotly visible, urgently visible topic, it ruptured the veneer of cruel optimism, the space where we pretended everything was fine. And it forced us into thinking about our agency, our behaviors, ritualistic or otherwise. And so that's why I return to Braidotti's thinking. Braidotti looks for generative potential, even if they can only be found in our biological existence, with its becomings that are able to do things, make things happen. Braidotti wants to create something alternative by, quote, working through the negative instances so as to collectively transform them into affirmative practices. I still bristle when I read that quote, okay? It troubles me. I start to criticize it, but at the same time, I do recognize the need to think of not just generative opacity, but also generative vitality as an area where we always have choices, where options are available to us, where we need to think outside of the impasse that Berland was talking about. I'm too good a student of Berland to believe in the grand emancipatory gesture, but we have to think ourselves out of that gap in which we believe nothing can be done. If we want to take biopolitics seriously, we need to think of what can be done to resist this. And that's why I have not been thinking so much about Foucault and discipline, but as Foucault and his relational approach to biopolitical struggle and how it allows us to reveal the blurring of lines between subjects and objects in the constantly shifting milieu called life. But, what to do? So Judith Butler, in her Adorno Prize reception speech, asks about whether we can talk about the question of good life when it is impossible to so many, and also when good life as a notion has been hijacked by neoliberalism. It's basically a consumer item. And that's why she returns to biopolitics. But what intrigues me in that speech is that Butler points out that by asking the question about good life, we are already negotiating forms of power because we are asking about the nature of life. And now here, I think it is productive to think of post-humanist thinkers like Donna Haraway, because when we think about life, we are not thinking about individuals only, but about complex set of relations, because we do not exist without the relations. We are always embedded in them. We all live in networks of dependency and vulnerability that the privileged are able to disavow, but nevertheless not think themselves out of. And it is this thing that I wanted to quote from Butler from that same speech. It's a long quote. All responsiveness to what happens is a function and effect of vulnerability. Whether it is an openness to registering a history that has not yet been told, or receptivity to what another body undergoes or has undergone, even when that body is gone. We can say that these are matters of empathy across time, but I want to suggest that part of what a body does is to open onto the body of another, or a set of others, and that is for this reason, bodies are not self-enclosed kinds of entities. They're always in some sense outside themselves, exploring or navigating their environment, extended and even sometimes dispossessed through the senses. We can become lost in another, or if our tactile, motile, haptic, visual, olfactory, or auditory capacities comport us beyond ourselves, that is because the body does not stay in its own place, and because dispossession of this kind characterizes bodily sense more generally. When being dispossessed in sociality is regarded as a constitutive function of what it means to live and persist, what difference does that make to the idea of politics itself? And I think this is a useful thing to keep in mind, that when we talk about biopolitics, we get out of discipline and we think about relations, especially affective relationality. This is my big, addition to the discussion during this event. Not in the sense that we have to have this kumbaya affirmation, but rather recognize our embodiment and the frictions it can create with the status quo. Because there are bodily gestures, as Butler says, such as refusal, silence, movement, or refusing to move, that can also be politically powerful. And it is they that help us remember that we don't need to overcome our vulnerability, but remember how to produce the conditions under which vulnerability and interdependency become livable. And this is where I come to my example of a text. As I said, it's a text that you haven't read, but it doesn't matter. I read it in March 2020, and it was very appropriate for the time. And it's interesting because quite early in the novel it explains why we all turn to fiction. Namely, when you wake up in a fictitious world, your only frame of reference is fiction. When you wake up in the pandemic, that is like a story, it doesn't seem real. So we look for answers in works of fiction, and I turn to something contemporary as opposed to Defoe. So unlike many of the dystopias that you're about to hear in this conference, this novel is very opaque and perhaps even snarky. This world in which the pandemic, as I said, a flu from China hits, is already suffering from crisis ordinariness. The inevitability of the crisis is recognized by many of the characters. One of them says, "The end begins before you're even aware of it. It passes as ordinary. It is just another thing." Initially, the end that the characters, most of the young, are musing about is contemporary neoliberalism. Or as one of the characters said, he could see clearly now. He could see the future. The future is more exponentially exploding rents. The future is more condo buildings, more luxury housing bought by shell companies of the global wealthy elite. The future is more Whole Foods, aisles of refrigerated cut fruit packaged in plastic container. The future just wants more consumers. The future is more newly arrived college grads and tourists in some fruitless search for authenticity. So this is the end that already has begun. And as another character who does try to find solutions in religion says, "We always knew it would happen, but I personally didn't know it would be this early." So this is the eventic frame that we get here. The first-person narrator is a second-generation Chinese immigrant who, I think again tellingly, works at a Bible publishing company. She's already spiritually homeless and unmoored before the pandemic. We get to know her name only on page 60, which I think is telling in itself, and we figure out who she is very gradually. She likes going to the office. She's a good neoliberal subject who gets lost in the taking of inventory because it snuffs out any worries, the feeling that she liked best about the office. She continues going to the office and moves into the office eventually to work out her contract, even when the rest of New York City is completely empty. So it's that kind of a novel. Her disaffected voice is very clearly apolitical. She walks past Occupy Wall Street without making any connection to them. So this normality then is upended by the fever from China, but that fever from China is very clearly metaphorical. It is neoliberal fever because it emphasizes what people were doing before. They mimic old routines and gestures that they have inhabited for years and decades until they die, literally, from putting on lipstick, moisturizer, washing dishes, laughing at TV shows. The other thing that kills people is nostalgia, the desire to go back to an imagined past. This sucks people into fever as well. Or as one of the characters says, the past is a black hole cut into the present day like a wound. If you come too close, you can get sucked in. You have to keep moving. The survivors indeed keep on moving until they reach their childhood homes or familiar malls, which then suck them into the fever. However, Candace is immune because remember, she has no roots. She has no space of nostalgia. Her memories of China are mixed up with TV documentaries. Her sense of her present in the United States is, cruel optimist. So she waits to get sick but nothing happened. I still wait. So this is, as you can see, a frame in which the pandemic itself registers as yet another inconvenience. The survivors in this narrative fall back on recognizable scenarios and repetitions. As I already said, after the end came the beginning. We found one another after fleeing New York for the safer pastures of the countryside. We'd seen it done in the movies, though no one could say which one exactly. A lot of things didn't play out as they had been depicted on screen. So that kind of a failure of previous narratives to help you didn't help. Neither did the media. Who knew what was true during the pandemic? The sheer density of information and misinformation at the end, encapsulated in news articles and message board theories and clickbait traps that had propagated hysterically through retweets and shares, had effectively rendered us more ignorant, more helpless, more innocent in our stupidity. Again, hallelujah, right? The survivors really think very much within the world that they come from. A quote that I really like is, "We Googled Maslow's pyramid to see how many of the need levels we could already fulfill, the first two. We Googled 2011 fever survivors, hoping to find others like us. And when all we found were the same outdated, inconclusive news articles, we Googled 7 stages of grief to track out our emotional progress. We were at anger, the slower among us, lagging behind at depression. We Googled, is there God? Clicked, I'm feeling lucky, and were directed to a suicide hotline site. In the 12 rings it took for us to hang up, we held our breaths for some stranger's voice confirming that we weren't the only ones living. There was no answer." So, the ritualistic behaviors of contemporary capitalism let our survivors down. They attempt to create a micro-community, like you see in films, with new roles and duties and also new rituals, for example, for scavenging the houses of people who have become fevered, or also for killing them. The religious meanings given to survival, however, do not stick, because the fact that we were alive held no special meaning. So there is no calming narrative of survival against all odds. The band of survivors is not heroic. They do not become the everyman stand-in for us. They do not build a new found family and survive. Instead, they gradually kill each other or they die. And what saves our protagonist to tell the tale is that she remains adrift. In the end, her sense of survival is not based on nostalgia for a more innocent biopolitical time and its rules, like for the other group members who tried to go back to the past and get the fever. She survives because she lacks the nostalgic narrative. She has to forge something new, something that is based on her biopower or her physical body, the desire for aliveness that enables her to be otherwise. But this otherwise is not created in pastoral landscape of the countryside or the suburbs where the other American survivors ritualistically flee. Instead, Candace goes to a city because city is a perfect embodiment of a community of strangers that is brought together by little micro practices of connection and friction in a kind of a ballet of interdependence and I would say hate many days. So in the end, she does not think of a revolution, but of the first toasty cigarette of the day and the smell of exhaust from all the cars. This is on the final page of the novel. There is actually no alternative. We do not get a survival, a regeneration, but we do get this message that return to a naive vision of nostalgic purity, when there was no disease, when there was no control, there was ritual that pulled us through and built a community, is shattered in this text. Instead, we need to face the music or face the reality that we're living in and relish in our biopower that can be a friction against biopolitical disciplines that are created not just in the community that had fallen apart, but also in the new communities that are formed. What kills the new community is the attempt to start controlling the survivors, their bodies, and especially the pregnant body of the protagonist. So control is ultimately not the answer. The narrative seems to suggest that we need to look for potentia in small things, in micro practices, because they help to show why communities break down and why contemporary biopolitics also fails. It fails to respect the individual ability to be a friction in the machine, to sometimes do a lot by doing nothing. And I think that it is these kinds of blind spots in biopolitics and the kinds of opaque narratives that are told about biopolitics can be a source of insight because they are opaque. They do not give us this very easy narrative of power, yeah, resistance, yeah, because that locks us into that vicious circle of repeating the same narratives, repeating the same messages. That's where I come back to that T-shirt by Zizek. He famously, I prefer not to borrows that from Bartleby the Scrivener by Melville, right? And says that sometimes doing nothing is the most violent thing at all because you sort of switch the topic of debate, so to say. And I think this would be really useful for us as well in this discussion, that instead of just arguing about biopolitics and resistance, but also think of what other narratives can we put into the table, because we cannot let this crisis go to waste. We need to think of ways of thinking ourselves out of this box. And that's what I will finish with.
Yes, thank you very much, Raili. First of all, for bringing a few other names into the game, and then also for relating that back to contemporary literature as well, and to what literature does with that, and what kind of role literature can play in these kind of social events and happenings. So, are there any questions?
Everybody wants to eat. It is about our embodiment. I have reminded you of your physical self. Yes, Timothy.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks for that very much. I was thinking about one of the last quotes, the fact that we were alive held no special meaning. And I was sort of trying to put that into conversation with that earlier very famous Deleuze quote, about the power of life as resistance. And sort of, maybe you could reflect on that just a little bit. I mean, is there, in that the power of resistance wouldn't be felt only in the mere fact of being alive, presumably, right? But it would be something that exceeds that sense of just vitality, I'm guessing, is how you want to think about that. But I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Right,
because I think that the main reason why I use that quote from the book is precisely that the survivors are looking for an explanation. Why did we survive and not others? And of course, the transcendental explanation is always most attractive. We were chosen. Right? There's something special about it, because in the case of such a massive event, so to say, people refuse its meaninglessness. And it is the narrator who believes that there is no such sacred meaning, that there is not, she's not special. Shit happens, some of us get lucky, kind of a response. And I think that can be the beginning of that kind of a inside the ritualistic world, as you yourself also reminded us today, we are kind of locked into very specific narrative patterns. And I think that if we sort of let go of that, we, with Deleuze, open up to a more sort of expanded sense of potentials and the ability to do different things. And by this, I don't mean to say that religious way of life deprives us of agency. Of course, Christianity is based on free will, and we engage in many acts of decision-making. But it sort of presupposes a certain relationship with our surroundings. And I think in the novel, that is taken away as a frame. Probably because, from the beginning, because the Bible is not a document of knowledge, it's a document of commerce. They package Bibles for different reasons. There's a famous an instance in which they make Bibles with jewelry on it because it makes a nice 18th birthday gift and stuff like that. So, that the power of religion to help us out of that is denied. So that's what I that explains that quote. Don't want to go deeper into Deleuze. Not right now.
I was just thinking about the impersonal as being
right.
kind of where that quote might be gesturing.
Yes, yes.
That would be the Deleuze.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Raili. It was really very, very interesting, and inspiring is probably the wrong term, but it definitely jogs all kinds of thoughts and approaches to this topic. The question I have is picking up where Timothy just also started probing this framework. If it is going back, pre-Deleuze, because Deleuze picked it up from Max Scheler, to say no is the human capacity par excellence, so resistance as being human. We tend to naturalize certain truths, let's call them that. So for instance, one naturalization of a certain type of truth is what you just mentioned, the most attractive explanation is the one that we're chosen, as opposed to shit happens and some are lucky. But is that really so? What if we survived because we did certain things? So which takes us back to the question Timothy raised, taking it as, and again, I don't think we need any of these thinkers to really be human. We can survive and act without knowing that, we can call it eventic or form or whatever. We can just do things. And so we didn't survive because we're lucky. We survived because we were smart. So Odysseus does not survive because he was chosen or because he was lucky. He was cunning and resourceful, right? So there is a third way or a fourth way. And where does this fit in the scheme that you have presented? That's my question.
I think that it needs to be added to the scheme, because the narrative that I have conveniently chosen to analyze is the one that takes that away, because it seems like this disease is very random. It really, nobody's immune, even when you know how you get it, you still get it. Because stuff is that. The only explanation that is provided that it's really bad to be nostalgic, that really hurts you. Because that leads you into that rut of repetition. It makes you do things that you have already done, and that in the end kills you. You need to do something that you haven't yet done. And whether that counts as cunning, well, in this context, I don't know. But I think in the broader sense, yes, that we need to put that agency element in the text, in the discussion of survival, very much so, because we need to have that as the alternative, because saying that we'll do nothing is not a potent way of really forging change. So I'm all for agency. I don't always believe in it. I have a hard time believing in agency sometimes, but I want to believe that it's possible. That's my faith mission.
I think there might be time for one more question from me here, because I would like to have, sorry, you'll get some pause afterwards. I would like to focus a little bit on the very important aspect to you as well, and that's the role of literature in all of this. And somehow I understood you at the end a little bit in that sense that, literature somehow is important because it does not necessarily take a clear position. Yeah, so it simply describes things from different viewpoints and so on, and that's certainly something very important in that. But I wonder in how far literature also adds a dimension to the discourse by being literature, by being a work of art, and by using literature in a much more open sense than we would in a debate with a clear position and argumentation, but just doing that by narrating and by having kind of poetic thinking, thinking that is done in language, because as we've mentioned before already, all of this is a question of narrative and storytelling somehow, or ritual forms or whatever. So we are constantly constructing kind of a story, and maybe literature helps us in order to debunk by a certain use of language to understand what's really going on in a certain kind of discourse.
The answer is yes. And I think that the value of literature is particularly, yes, in the form, not the narrative necessarily, but the form itself guides us into, like for example, in a text like mine, it puts you in that frame of, you know, a new universe has opened up for us. How do we make sense of it? So the opacity of the narrative itself, the lack of point of view, the, you know, the fragmentation of the narrative, they are forms of putting us in a situation where we can experience things better than a philosophical treatise, because we are lost in a narrative. We, with a narrator, are trying to piece it together, we are trying to make sense, and I think literature does that so much better than, for example, public health announcements, because we are experiencing something. Something becomes part of us, and particularly using poetic potential of literature. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to talk about works of art. They show us not just imaginaries, but as formal devices. They allow us to experience being otherwise or testing different scenarios. And that has been, I think, underappreciated in general.
Yeah, that was what's very dear to me as well.
Yes.
Yeah? So this creative element, it constructs and creates a way of thinking, and we need to have always this kind of corrective against biopolitical forces in some ways. Yeah. Okay, but we are over time. Thank you very much, Raili, for your paper.